not known whether the French African Army will contest our landing. But all resistance, by whomever offered, must be destroyed. Remember, the French are not Nazis or Japs.
On this Sunday, November 8, 1942, an Anglo-American armada of 120,000 men is approaching the coast of North Africa. Operation Torch, secretly designed by Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt, is a strategic bet. The goal is to relieve Stalin's Red Army, their ally who's struggling in Stalingrad, by forcing Hitler to mobilize more men in North Africa. The success of Operation Torch and the assault seems like a very risky bet. Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, according to the peace treaty signed in 1940, are not occupied by the Nazis, but are controlled by a French army devoted to their leader, Marshal Pétain, and his right-hand man, Admiral Darlan. The army is anti-British, since part of its fleet was sunk on Churchill's orders at Mers el-Kabir in 1940. How will the French react to this assault? Who among their leaders could play the role of an asset, ready to resume the fight against Germany? Those are the questions that the American Secret Service and diplomats have been trying to solve for 2 years.
3,000 miles away from Washington was Vichy, the forlorn capital of fallen France.
Early 1941, the United States is not yet at war. In the eyes of Roosevelt, General de Gaulle represents nothing. Vichy remains the legal French government. The mission of the American ambassador Leahy is to inquire with Marshal Pétain and determine if he would be likely to join forces in case of an American intervention. Half of France is occupied by the Wehrmacht, and the Vichy state, whose army has been reduced to a few divisions in unoccupied areas and North Africa, is under pressure. The Germans demand a military collaboration. The Americans, aware of the difficulty to reverse the situation in France, begin to focus on North Africa, which, despite the close presence of German troops in Libya, in Hitler's strategic apparatus. General Weygand, who has been named General Delegate in North Africa by Marshal Pétain, is the first potential asset to be considered by the Americans. Weygand, an adept of the National Revolution ideology, has in a few months transformed Algiers into a French fascist experiment.
The French flag was flying over Algeria. The French army was there, apparently undefeated. Propaganda had created a strong anti-English feeling. The population was actually happy to see that Germany was about to win the war, and that they'd be able to negotiate with them afterwards.
Severe repression discourages dissidents and encourages denunciations. The internment camps are filled with opponents to the regime: communists, Republicans, and Freemasons. Jews who had become French by a 1870 decree are downgraded to indigenous subjects, excluded from state administration, and see their properties confiscated.
They had a hard time admitting it because they were, how can I put this? They were patriots. They had fought for France. They had helped France.
In January 1941, Robert Murphy, an American diplomat, arrives in Algiers. He is Roosevelt's trusted man, the secret architect of Operation Torch. The official objective of his mission is to bring financial help to the local populations, to make sure that the goods aren't sent to France, where the German army could seize them. 12 American overseers join Murphy in the spring.
Part of our mission was to do everything we could to contribute to the relative independence of North Africa, compared to occupied France during that time. The other mission, given to Bob Murphy, was to develop a good relationship with Weygand, because of course, without mentioning it, we always had in mind the idea of a military operation, and Weygand seemed like the perfect man for it.
The Americans had hopes in Weygand. It made sense. He had been chief of the defense staff for Foch. How can you possibly think that Foch's right-hand man wouldn't want the liberation of France? They couldn't believe it. He was asked several times, and through several intermediaries, if he would one day rally to the Allied cause. This was his answer. No, absolutely not. In fact, I'll inform Vichy of your intentions. He would always do that, warn Marshal Pétain of everything, and therefore the Germans too.
Weygand, unlike Darlan and Pétain, who are caving under Nazi pressure, is above all a patriot and a legalist. He intends to follow strictly the conditions of the peace treaty condemning France to a defensive neutrality, towards England, of course, but also towards Italy and Germany, whose troops are at Tunisia's doors. But for a few military dissidents who are organizing their revolt, this neutrality is just an illusion.
Despite our clandestine mobilization, despite the amount of weapons we had hidden, it would have been almost impossible to oppose German action. So, the neutrality could only serve the Germans, who were keeping an area of operations that they would occupy whenever they wanted.
At the Hotel du Parc, the government's headquarters, Admiral Darlan presented the results of his negotiations with the German government and the results of his meeting with Chancellor Hitler.
Darlan will be the real asset in Operation Torch. He is Marshal Pétain's right-hand man. He just opened the way to what will become the collaboration policy. Under the pretext of a potential release of prisoners, he agrees to a French logistical help to the German troops fighting against the British in Libya.
What isn't known at all is that the officers of the Army of Africa, or at least many of them, who personally delivered the supplies to the Rommel army, they are the ones who stole from the oil reserves, who stole the trucks, the cannons. So the first time, they probably did it full of rage, I'm sure. The second time, 2 weeks later, they did it again, and then they got used to doing it. They got used to working for the German army. So it's no surprise that there was no shortage in November 1942.
Following the alliance with the Nazis, Darlan will end up firing the picky Weygand, whose head was demanded by Hitler. At the same time, Murphy's mission is playing a new card in the game, the resistance card. In Oran, Henry Dastier de la Vigerie, who is at the head of a civilian and officers' clandestine network, meets with the Vice Consul Ridgway Knight.
Very early on in our discussions, we assumed that there was going to be a landing, even before Pearl Harbor took place. Very early on, I shared our interest in getting information about troop movements and all other sorts of things like that.
In Algiers, too, a few young people appalled by the situation organized themselves without any link to de Gaulle in London.
We thought that one day the United States would come and save us. It was an idea that came from a few hundred young men, Republicans, more or less anti-fascists, all kinds of anti-fascists, among which there were many Jews, of course.
But how could we reach Free France from Rétif? It was impossible. So I thought I needed to go to Algiers, which was a port where I might meet people who could help me.
So the first thing I asked José was if he knew a way I could go up to Gibraltar to join the Free French forces. He immediately told me, don't get your hopes up too high, because there have already been a few escape attempts, and people had been caught and are now in prison. The Vichy police is very dangerous. I don't recommend you trying anything. Lay low for the moment. There might be something more interesting for you here, instead of heading off to Gibraltar.
On December 1st, 1941, Pétain and Darlan are summoned at Saint-Florentin by Marshal Goering.
Conversations lasted more than 3 hours, which leads us to believe that all the questions regarding the evolution of the Franco-German relationship, along with the position of France in Europe, had been discussed.
Goering demands guarantees from the French in case of withdrawal by the Germans toward Tunisia. Vichy gives in and designs a defense plan against the British.
Just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, in Washington, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill together in the dark days of late 1941, the two Allied leaders discussed their strategy.
As soon as the United States get involved in the war, Churchill rushes to the White House. The secret conversations concern the urgency and the modalities of a military operation in Western Europe, France, or North Africa. Roosevelt categorically refuses to associate General de Gaulle to the project. Trusting a serviceman, a self-designated leader of a so-called Free France, is out of the question. But in April 1942, Pétain and his new right-hand man, Pierre Laval, increase the collaboration policy. The American president witnesses the permanent failure of his diplomatic endeavors with Vichy and calls his ambassador back.
And at that moment, the military aspect, the landing preparations, meeting up the military, and trying to have an influence took more importance over our needs and information.
Following the first contact with the Americans, the Algerian resistance have set the goal of momentarily neutralizing the city of Algiers while the Allies are landing. They've rallied around two men.
One of them was Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, a 45-year-old former monarchist who had probably shouted "Death to the Jews" in his youth in the Latin Quarter. And myself, a 22-year-old Jew who probably had just as much dislike for him as he had for me. We met in Hotel St. George. Well, we ended up getting along very well, through the strength of patriotism, that feeling that has now been forgotten. There was something incredible that you would have had trouble imagining. So, Henri d'Astier was the leader of this small group of men, a group of 4 men altogether, no more. And they were all from the French extreme right wing. He believed that everything depended on the army rallying their cause. They were the ones in contact with the American envoy, Robert Murphy. As for us, we would continue what we had started, recruiting and training men. Then everyone would be free after liberation.
The task force, led by Captain Pillefort and his right-hand man, Mario Fevre, complete this new organization.
One morning, I got a phone call asking, "Are you Mario Fevre?" "Yes." "Be at Tontonville at 2 p.m. I showed up and immediately recognized one of the officers. It was Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie. Once you've seen him, you can't forget his face. He had airs of royalty, a lot of class. We talked for 3 minutes. He told me, "I'm going to introduce you to the man that will be your chief when it comes to preparing everything." And all of a sudden, 3 tables away from me, I see Pillefort. Henri d'Astier says, "Let me introduce you to the man who will be working with you." Then we burst out laughing, Pillefort and I. Pillefort says, "We've been working together for months." And Henri d'Astier had this disenchanted statement, "There are so few of us."
In May 1942, the resistance's right wing proposes a new asset to the Americans, General Giraud, who had just escaped from Germany. He would take the lead of an inter-ally reconquest of North Africa. Contacted by the Americans, Giraud, who doesn't hide his affinity for Pétain's national revolution, agrees to risk his notoriety.
In Stalingrad, by day and by night, the German squadrons support the progression of the troops on the ground, surrounding the city from the north, west, and south. Wave after wave, the bombers harass the Soviet troops and their fortifications.
In summer 1942, Hitler, who is struggling with the Soviets, is stuck in Stalingrad. He fears the emergence of a new front in the west. While maintaining some of his elite troops in Normandy, he starts a double offensive. First in Egypt, where Marshal Rommel, who had reached Alexandria, crushes the British troops. Then in the Caucasus, south of Stalingrad. Stalin is in disarray and renews his plea to his Anglo-American allies to start an operation in the west, but it remains to decide where the most effective area would be, the Normandy coast or northern Africa. The Giraud option, the help from the Algiers resistance on one side, Vichy's turnaround rendered impossible, and the refusal to involve de Gaulle will speed up the American decision. The 23rd of July, de Gaulle is granted a meeting with the American commanders who were passing through London. He intends to express his strategic views concerning potential operations on French soil.
De Gaulle spoke for half an hour in complete silence, with not one answer. After half an hour, he understood that there was nothing to expect from the Americans. He gathered his notes, got up, and left. The fact was that if those generals were in London, it was only to discuss the strategy of their upcoming operations on the Atlantic front. The Americans developed the idea of landing in France. But in reality, they didn't have the means to do it. Churchill used all his energy to try to persuade them to land in North Africa. And it's indeed the day after meeting with de Gaulle on the 24th and 25th of July 1942 that the decision to land in North Africa in November was made and validated by Roosevelt.
Manpower. America's millions have long been trained in industry. The skill and strength of more than 60 million men and women is now devoted to the production of the materials of war.
Nobody saw much of it. Nobody knew what was happening. It was a secret, and the secret was being kept.
Algiers, October 12th. Robert Murphy comes back from a meeting in Washington carrying a heavy secret. The date of Operation Torch is set for the 7th and 8th of November 1942. The same day, a potential and unexpected asset resurfaces. Admiral Darlan had Murphy approached by his chief of staff in Algiers.
The question of Darlan was raised. Would it be more efficient to use him because he had shown some signs? We didn't really know because it seemed that he also showed some signs of interest in changing sides. And that's when Churchill said this extraordinary thing. Even though he hated and despised Darlan, he said, "I'd be willing to kiss his ass if he brings us the Toulon fleet."
Murphy played them wonderfully. Because what Murphy said was, "One day will come, but without authorization from the French government, only if you request it." He also said, "We'll come when we're ready," and we're not ready yet.
In order to keep appearances up, Robert Murphy maintains his basic diplomatic activities, but in reality, he is impatiently waiting that Gibraltar, the Allied commandment post, confirms the arrival of a submarine bringing American officers in charge of finalizing the last details of the operation.
These men crawl under barbed wire, while live machine gun bullets crack only 2 feet above their head.
The phone rings. Murphy tells me, "What the hell are you doing, Ridgway? Why are you being so lame? We need you at the consulate. Come immediately." When I arrived at the consulate, I found Murphy astounded, saying that they're right there off the coast, but that they don't have enough oxygen to stay until tomorrow.
We kept pacing along the water up until one moment when, in the dark, since it was a moonless night, we saw 2 kayaks approach us and 2 officers got off. And they took out something I'd never seen, a walkie-talkie, and they started communicating with the submarine. We couldn't see anything. We couldn't see a submarine or anything.
On the evening of October 21st, 1942, an American reconnaissance mission lands on a beach around Cherchell, 55 miles west of Algiers. General Clark personally comes to meet the Algiers resistance.
General Clark was well aware that we had contacts, that we had friends. As for the role they could play during the landing, like every professional serviceman, we weren't too sure. It's in the nature of a serviceman.
It was early in the morning that several cars arrived, with 3 military experts who were assisting General Mast in order to give the American military the feeling that the resistance had high-level officers in their ranks and that they had all the tools they needed for this kind of operation.
The Americans exposed their point of view, and the big question that came up was the commandment in North Africa. It was agreed that General Giraud would command the operations in North Africa. When? In principle, after the first landing phase. But they were very evasive.
General Clark leaves without informing the French that at the very moment where the secret meeting was being held on October 22nd, 35,000 GIs under the commandment of General Patton are boarding in the United States towards Morocco. Another convoy has left from Scotland and is on its way to Algeria with Oran and Algiers as targets. On the 31st of October, Robert Murphy finally informs everyone that the landing is scheduled for November 8th and that Giraud's plan has been approved by Roosevelt. There are only 6 days to prepare. Colonel Just plans to give power to fascist civil organizations as a backup plan in case of a British attack on Algiers.
Just tells me, we're going to use the safety plan. I'll give you armbands. And instead of attacking the guards, the commandment, and the communication centers, we'll go peacefully with orders signed by me, or Mast, Giraud's representative, to take over their duties as part of a safety drill. Brilliant idea.
On the 7th, around 7 a.m., the phone rang, and Pitafore tells me, gather everybody. Let's meet at 6, 26 Rue Michelet Street, at the Aboulair family house. Everything is organized.
The mission given to the 400 young resistants in Algiers is to hold strategic positions in Algiers as long as possible until the arrival of the Americans and of General Giraud, who is supposed to rally the French army in Africa. But things are not going to unfold as planned. At 3 p.m., Giraud is still not in Algiers and has just arrived clandestinely in France with Captain Beaufort, 620 miles away in Gibraltar, where the American commandment post is located. He wants General Eisenhower in charge of Operation Torch to make his role of Allied Commander-in-Chief in North Africa official.
So at that moment, Eisenhower says, I'm not aware of that. This is the first time I'm hearing about it, which is obviously a lie. He asked Clark to come. Clark was at the Churchill conference. But Clark starts speaking English. Giraud at that time didn't understand a word of English, so they could say whatever they wanted and he wouldn't get it. Clark said the old man has his derrière in the snow, which means they played him.
I was brought into a room that was full of people, around 20 to 25 people or so. The room was blue with cigarette smoke. Everybody was unknown to me except 4 or 5 faces.
For the first time, I saw Robert Murphy, and it gave me trust. I didn't need to be reassured, but I liked seeing that the radio was in a room of the 26. And that through Morse, they were in permanent contact with the Allied fleet that was coming towards us.
A man started speaking. It was Colonel Just. He gave us the password that was ironically whiskey, and we had to answer soda. That was perfect for the Americans. Then he gave us the mission orders, giving us credit, and that were also ironically authentic.
I received the mission order from the Villa des Oliviers. It was the house of the superior commander of the North African troops. But my problem was that I didn't know where it was located.
I looked at mine. My mission was simply to occupy the prefecture.
It became a public place, my father's house. The police ended up worrying about all the activity, and the chief of police arrived at number 26, Rue Michelet. He arrived too late, because at 10 p.m., everything was already planned. We caught him in front of my door and locked him up inside a room.
We got inside the Lave garage. There was mass confusion. There were men running all over the place, car doors slamming all around. Everyone was trying to find their own way of doing things.
And during that time, we created a sort of chain. I was handing out armbands for volunteers.
At that moment, I came in with 50 other guys. They had no idea in the headquarters. They didn't believe there was another drill. We arrested them immediately. We unplugged all the cables. In just a few seconds, the Mogador headquarters were out of service.
All of a sudden, 2 agents arrived, alerted by the noise. I presented them my mission order and told them, I need you. I have to occupy the prefecture. We're fearing incidents tonight. So they banged on the door, yelling, police, open up. The door opened, and a man half asleep appeared. We thanked the 2 cops. They left, and we got inside the prefecture and locked the doors.
To take over the 19 Corps, we arrived. The door opens. It was General Colt, wearing a robe and pajamas. So Colonel Jules tells him, General, tonight the Americans are landing, and we resume the fight against the enemy. General Colt, mad with rage, in a state close to apoplexy, began to yell, You'll be executed! You'll be executed! I'm arresting you!
I took control over the central police station with 20 other men. And I began getting calls from the local police station telling me it had all worked out.
I had no idea of whom was inside the villa. I knew General Juin was supposed to be there, since it was his house. I saw no one go in, except 1 or 2 cars with white lights. They were American cars, the cars from the consulate. I let them go by.
Murphy went to go see the commander, General Juin, in his home at the Villa des Oliviers, a little after midnight. He tells them that the Americans are on their way. We want to free France. We have no other ambitions. Join us. Or at least, don't shoot on your American friends.
Juin, a bit lost at first, refuses to take the responsibility of a ceasefire, especially since nothing proves that the Americans are here. They're still hours away from their objectives. They offer to contact Darlan, who by complete chance is in Algiers visiting his son severely ill. Darlan rushes to the Villa des Oliviers.
Darlan is furious. He insults Murphy, he insults the Americans. He says, "You idiots, we'll throw you in the sea." And then little by little, he calms down and holds the same reasoning that he had had with Juin. And he says, "I can't decide. I take my orders from Marshal Pétain. I need to check with Marshal Pétain."
Murphy agrees to send a telegram from Darlan to the Admiralty in Algiers. The carrier takes the initiative to stop at 26 Rue Michelet, the headquarters of the resistance, where Father Cordier, Henri d'Astier de la Vigérie's right-hand man, had remained.
I opened the door, and I read a text in which I understood that it was a message from Marshal Pétain, in which Admiral Darlan was explaining the situation and in a disguised way was giving the order to resist the landing. So I said, this message cannot go through.
Around 2 a.m., the American fleet is in sight of the beaches of Sidi Farouche, 12 miles away from Algiers.
And here I am, waving because I could hear something coming from the sea. I shouted, "Whiskey, whiskey," waiting to hear soda. I can hear an engine getting closer, and I realized at that moment that the voices on the other side were angry because the troops landing were not given the password. That was very dangerous. We almost got ourselves killed.
During the first phase of the operation, many soldiers drowned, and the Allies suffered numerous casualties, provoking a serious delay.
They didn't know how to drive the boats. Well, in any case, they improved the boat's engines later on. And you have to admit that the landing in North Africa was their very first, and it helped them prepare for the next one. They were real rookies at it.
It was 3:30 in the morning. We had to call Algiers to tell them that the Americans had landed because they were detaining the radio station, the post office, the central police station, etc. with rifles. I brought this first American at 3 a.m. at 26 Rue Michelet, and then I ran to the central station to tell José Abouker that the Americans had arrived. I brought one with me, and then José Abouker broadcast the news saying that hundreds of thousands of Americans have landed in Algiers. Ades just brought one with him.
At the same moment, the cannons of the Vichy Admiralty that hasn't been occupied by the resistance open fire on 2 British destroyers trying to get into Algiers harbor. The city is woken up by the shots. 300 GIs have managed to land, but 10 died. The others are captured. All the communication lines are shut down. Everyone rushes to the local police stations.
And that's how a gigantic trap was set. I had people come to the central police station or show up on their own. A good amount of them were high-ranking officials. For instance, the person who replaced the Governor General of Algeria, Mr. Ettori, who was a real son of a bitch. And I was really pleased to welcome him as he gets out of his car, just 10 minutes after I told him, "Come quickly, we're waiting for you." I was so pleased to tell the police officers to lock him up in a cell.
At that moment, I figured out this is the right time. So I went to see the prefect and told him, "Sir, you asked me who I was, who are my leaders, and what we wanted. Well, it's my honor to tell you, the Americans are landing." I've never seen a man so shocked and so surprised. And at that moment, during that very second, I realized that he didn't know anything. And if he didn't, neither did the intelligence services, the army, nor the government. No one knew anything.
The resistance have succeeded. Despite a few scuffles in the port of the capital, the whole of Algiers is taken over. At Sidi Farouche, the landing operations follow their chaotic progress without opposition from the French. In Oran, it's the opposite. The area witnesses a violent sea battle, and inland the advance of the American troops is stopped by the Vichy forces. In Morocco, the military authorities have declared a state of emergency, while the Allied fleet is still 2 hours away from the shores. In Algiers at 6 a.m., a mobile guard unit retakes the Villa des Oliviers and frees Juin and Darlan. Murphy, who begins to worry about the delay of his countrymen, is arrested. The recapture of the resistance objectives begins.
We see policemen on each side of the street with rifles and mortars, and they told us to surrender immediately or they will destroy us. So we try to stall them, and all of a sudden a friend appears. And he tells us, "Giraud has spoken, and he is taking the commandment of North Africa."
This call by Giraud is actually a trick by the resistance who occupy Radio Algiers. The general is still in Gibraltar. At dawn on Sunday, November 8th, while General Patton's tanks land in Morocco under heavy fire, a first telegram from Vichy reaches Darlan. The Germans offer their help. Their Air Force troops based in Sicily. Darlan agrees. In the city center, the grand post office held by the resistance is raided.
Just had said, "Don't shoot under any circumstances." But I couldn't follow those instructions. So I said, "Whatever you do, don't shoot first. We need to talk, we need to negotiate, we need to stall them, but don't get yourself killed."
On the stairs of the Grand Post Office, Jean Dreyfus, in charge of the group of resistance, agrees to meet with the Vichy military.
The commander asked him to surrender. He refused. And as he was walking back up the stairs, he was cowardly shot in the back by someone in his unit, the 5 Hunter Regiment, and he was killed.
In the morning, the Americans finally make their way towards Algiers, but doubting the success of the resistance mission, they stop outside of the city. At 12 p.m., the counteroffensive organized by Juin and Darlan forces the resistance to leave most of their positions. Captain Pillefort sets up a roadblock at the entrance of the city to delay the mobilization of the Vichy forces. He is joined at 4 p.m. by José Aboulker.
All of a sudden, a car came up. Pillefort moves forward. He has his sword underneath his arm, like a tank captain.
He starts to say, "Colonel, please, come out of the car. You're being held until the American landing operation is complete." He hadn't even finished his sentence that
some guy opens the door and shoots Pillefort down.
Pillefort is here. They shoot, I shoot.
Now several of us are shooting.
The captain, I never thought someone could hide that much under the dashboard. I didn't really aim at him. The colonel tried to get out. He had already been shot several times. Blood was coming out of his skull. He was dead. That was it for the colonel who had just killed Pillefort.
At 5 p.m., when the first American reconnaissance units enter the city, Murphy, who has been freed, brings back from the Sidi Farouche beaches a high-ranked American military official at Fort l'Empereur, where Darlan and Juin have retreated. With Giraud still away,
and all of a sudden I saw cars driving slowly. They were funny little square cars. I didn't know what they were. They were jeeps, of course. But I didn't know at the time. There were 4 men per jeep, all armed, who were looking on both sides of the streets, with a finger on the trigger, ready to fire. And there was an American flag by the windshield. My God, I said. Here they are. We did it. I went to bed.
On Monday, November 9th, 5 p.m., the German Air Force, after receiving the green light from Darlan the previous day, begins bombing Algiers. Landing under the bombs, General Clark's mission is to negotiate a ceasefire in North Africa and have France join America in the war. 4 never-ending days of negotiation begin, during which Darlan and his team fear the Germans' reaction in France. Darlan will do everything he can to prevent the Vichy's North Africa from leaving the state of neutrality imposed by the peace treaty.
Those men had been collaborating with Germany for over 2 years. And all of a sudden, the Americans land, when they were not expecting them. And the question they were asking themselves was, what's going to happen? No one knew who was going to win. Just because the Americans have landed, it doesn't mean that they're going to succeed. Hitler is still moving at high speed towards the Soviet Union, towards the Caucasus, and he's going to take Stalingrad in a few days. That's what all the newspapers are saying, every morning.
On the evening of November 9th, Darlan, who hasn't given up anything, wires the American peace plan to Pétain. On the morning of the 10th, fights resume in Morocco. Oran, under military pressure, surrenders. The negotiations start again without Giraud, who finally arrived in Algiers but is no longer the right asset.
Clark had elite troops. I think they were Marines. They surrounded the villa where everything was happening. And when Darlan said, "I have to think about it. I have to talk to the marshal first," Clark stood up and said, "You have half an hour to answer. You are my prisoners. If you don't answer with a yes, you'll be arrested." And the Americans left and let Darlan, Juin, Coles, and the others talk amongst each other. 20 minutes later, they told the Americans, "You can come in now." Darlan says yes.
Darlan is ready to sign a ceasefire in North Africa, under the condition that he be the political ruler in the name of Marshal Pétain, and that General Giraud has no military responsibility. But at 6:25, a telegram by Pétain comes in. I had given the order to defend ourselves against the aggressor. I maintain my orders. Darlan is out of the game.
General Clark turns towards me and he says, "This idiot just told me that he received a telegram from Pétain forbidding him to sign. So I had him arrested." At that moment, Giraud comes back into the game, even though we thought that Giraud was gone. So we move into the Summer Palace, and we finally have an official front.
Half an hour later, Darlan tries a final bluff. The admiral claims to have received a secret telegram from Vichy that would cancel the order from the marshal, allegedly held hostage by the Germans.
The Anglo-American action against our African empire has forced the German troops to cross the line of demarcation in order to occupy our Mediterranean coasts.
If in France the Vichy troops offered no resistance to the Germans, things are very different in Morocco, where General Patton, after 3.5 days of intense fighting, imposed a ceasefire. In Algiers, Clark demands that the French troops join the American efforts in Tunisia, where the Germans are heading. But Pétain pulls a new card out of his sleeve. He appoints General Noguès the next day, his only representative in Morocco. And Darlan is out of the game again. Mandated by Pétain, Noguès' instructions are to keep France away from the conflict between the Axis and the Allies, and to keep Giraud out of the negotiations.
Giraud walks towards Noguès, and Noguès tells him, "I don't shake a traitor's hand." Clark arrives and says, "Gentlemen, come in." General Noguès says, "After what happened, the fights that happened, the French army has no other option than to maintain a neutral yet benevolent attitude. We cannot join the war like that." To which Giraud stands up and answers, "Absolutely not. I believe that if the French army doesn't want to go to war, I consider it a great shame, and I am ready to raise a militia." And Darlan says, "I completely agree with General Giraud, and I too want to raise a militia."
Giraud's proposition works in favor of Darlan and Noguès. A French militia fighting under the American banner would not engage the Vichy state. The Americans who are already on their way to Tunisia are tired by the dragging negotiations.
An important amount of material is being transported through the Mediterranean Sea towards the port of Bizerte.
As they did during the invasion of the Free Zone in France, the French troops of Tunisia passively witnessed the arrival of the Germans.
More than ever, I ask you fidelity and dignity. I remind you that the Marshal and his government are under the legitimate authority to whom we owe obedience.
In Algiers, an infuriated General Clark threatens to imprison the French generals. Juin rushes to Noguès and tells him,
"You don't want General Giraud to lead a militia, do you? It doesn't make any sense." All right, shake hands. Noguès sticks his arm out and they shake hands. At that moment, Clark's door opens. And I rush towards him, and I say, "Everything is settled. General Giraud is taking control of the North African troops." He answers, "Finally."
General Eisenhower is there for the final meeting. Giraud is named commander of the North African Army, with Juin under his orders. Admiral Darlan becomes High Commissioner for France in North Africa. But there are a lot of casualties to report. 470 and 720 injured on the Anglo-American side, and 1,346 dead and 2,000 injured on the French side. At the end of the month, the first French units are sent to the Tunisian front, and in the following months, the patriotic propaganda will try to erase the sad story into which the Vichy military had dragged their army.
And that's how the French army of North Africa resumed the fight. Not the way people think it happened, not the way history has summarized it, the Americans finally came to Africa and the Army of Africa resumed combat.
In Tunisia, the French stopped the Germans from advancing. The old French rifles have allowed the British and American tanks to come to the rescue. The French are back. The French of Laminat, the French of Leclerc, and the French of the Army of Africa.
That's how history was told in the Vichy legend, erasing the 5 days during which the generals had to be forced to stop fighting against the Americans and were then forced to join the Allies. They gave way to violence.
Operation Torch is over from a military standpoint. The Americans have established a stronghold in North Africa that will allow them to start an offensive on Sicily in the summer of 1943. And finally, Operation Torch will end up being an extraordinary practice run for the D-Day landing. But for the moment in Algiers, the political consequences remain uncertain. Dastier and Cordier are given responsibilities within the Darlan-Giraud team.
The Admiral did what he had to do to keep us involved. And I was put in charge of intelligence for a while. Of course, why not?
Our comrades from the extreme right wing, our resistance comrades, our real comrades, while we became opponents, they became ministers for Darlan. There's no reason to be shocked by that. The Allies were there. There was an extreme right-wing solution. How wouldn't they have been a part of it?
Finally, nothing had really changed. The same prefect that I had arrested was in his prefecture. Same policemen that had been chasing us were still doing it. The same Vichy army was still there. Nothing had changed.
In der Nacht zum 27. November gaben der Führer und der Duce den Befehl, die Festung Toulon zu besetzen. Deutschland und Italien beantworteten damit den Wortbruch französischer Generale und Admirale, die den Kriegshafen Toulon und die französische Kriegsflotte den Briten und Amerikanern ausliefern wollten. Ein Teil der französischen Flotte hat sich trotz des Gegenbefehls der französischen Regierung versenkt.
Faithful to the Marshal, the French sailors chose to sink their own ships. This mess, a direct consequence of Pétain's neutrality, crushes Darlan's main asset. The Admiral, now without a fleet, is therefore of no use to the Americans. Henri Dastier de la Vigerie and his extreme right-wing friends considered proposing a new card to the Americans: a king for an admiral. The Count of Paris, in exile in Algiers, would replace Darlan. On December 24th at 3 p.m., Fernand Bonnier de la Chapelle, a young 20-year-old man, enters Darlan's office and kills him. He is immediately arrested and after a quick trial is executed 2 days later. We'll never know if he had been manipulated and by whom. General Giraud, named as Darlan's successor by the Americans, has Dastier and Cordier arrested. But in front of the number of people involved, he ends up burying the investigation.
Some drank to celebrate Darlan's death. General de Gaulle was surprised. I believe it's true. That's what his memoirs say. That's what several witnesses confirm. And he did immediately send a telegram to General Giraud offering to join forces, to meet as quickly as possible in French territory.
A meeting was arranged between Generals de Gaulle and Giraud, who had succeeded Admiral Darlan, assassinated a month earlier. Part of the meeting was to grow the union of the fighting French, who had never lost hope, and the French for whom hope had been reborn.
A harsh struggle surrounds the handshake between Giraud, the military who maintained the fascist-like regime in Algiers, and de Gaulle, the politician, who is already thinking about what the post-liberation France will be. The young Algiers resistance have, for the most part, joined the 7th Battalion of the French African Corps, a Gaullist dissidents in Giraud's army. They fight next to the Americans in Tunisia. In May 1943, José Albuquerque reaches London and has a meeting with the general.
And de Gaulle, whose political future was about to be decided in Algiers a few weeks later, didn't care about news from Algiers at all. He was only thinking about the resistance in France. He was only thinking about France. And gradually, I realized that de Gaulle was telling this young resistant from Algiers about the resistance in France.
On May 31st, 1943, de Gaulle, designated as leader of Free France by the National Council of Resistance, arrives from London and meets the crowd for the first time. On that day, de Gaulle's legend is in action, and he sends the young Algiers heroes into history's oblivion.
The French political authorities and armies had been fooled. It wasn't very glorious for them. On the other hand, de Gaulle was not aware of the landing, and that wasn't very glorious for him either. Therefore, the two factors leading to this oblivion have converged to create an even bigger oblivion. This is how I personally explain how this operation, and the Americans recognize it too, was the real turning point of the Second World War. This is how this operation was forgotten. People remember the American landing, of course, but the inside resistance and the fact that Algiers was the first operation of the French resistance are completely forgotten.